Hi everyone. I'm going to attempt to do what I've seen some of my fellow presenters do yesterday, and I'm going to try to present a whole PhD in 15 minutes because I'm now Dr. Kelly. And I'm going to my graduation next week where I get to wear my silly hat and really be Dr. Kelly and everything like that. So I'm really looking forward to that. But obviously before I begin, I do want to acknowledge and pay respect to the ancestors of the lands upon which I'm presenting today, which is also the lands upon which I work and live, and acknowledge ancestors and future leaders, and acknowledge that the land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'm going to apologise in advance. I haven't been well this week. I didn't want to miss the opportunity to actually come to the first in-person conference in 2.5 years and have to attend the whole thing on Zoom. So I am here. I haven't had as much prep time as I want. You can see I've got notes. I never speak with notes, but we'll see how we go. So a PhD in less than 15 minutes. I'll see what I can do. My PhD is about student engagement. Was a high school teacher for 10 years, and my interest in student engagement came around from seeing the differences in the classroom, how the students interacted, how they learned, how the teachers acted, how they taught, and I didn't really understand what those differences were. And when I started doing research, in my master's I actually looked at scaffolding. I thought maybe this is the answer. But when I started thinking about doing my PhD and started reading about student engagement, I thought, you know what, I think this is something that can actually make a difference. So what is student engagement? I approached it, or it's understood to be a multi-dimensional construct. Complex way of saying it's made up of a couple of different parts. So I looked at it as having 3 parts or 3 dimensions. So having behavioural engagement, emotional engagement, and cognitive engagement. So essentially considering students' thoughts, feelings, and actions in regards to their engagement in the classroom. Why did I choose student engagement? I chose it for a number of different reasons. There's a lot of research on student engagement, and it's been quite prolific for a couple of decades now. There's a lot of research around the fact that it can prevent school dropout and at-risk behaviours in schools. There's a lot of research around the fact that it can counter students' dip in their sense of belonging. This particular research is based on PISA data from 2015, which found that in Australia, in our high schools, 1 in 5 students have a low sense of belonging. They feel like they don't belong in their school where they're being educated, and student engagement is one way to counter that. The teachers who implement effective pedagogies, so pedagogies is just a fancy word for teaching strategies. So teachers who implement effective teaching strategies have students who are ahead in their learning. And that teachers do play a crucial role. It's been proved again and again in research. But my interest, as I said, going back to my classroom experience, is that it doesn't always match up. A student can behave in one class and behave differently in another class, can enjoy one subject, not enjoy another subject, enjoy a subject 1 year with one teacher and differently with another teacher. And how they behave can change during a week, a day, or even a lesson. So these are all things we need to take into consideration. But what interested me, I'm really interested in the teacher's perspective on all this and the teacher's beliefs, is the fact that teachers actually understand student engagement to be different things. And they think of it in terms of the students' actual actions, their behavioural engagement, or maybe just how they think, their cognitive engagement, or maybe how they feel. Are they enjoying the classroom, their emotional engagement? Because we are talking about a PhD, and I know some of you are right at the beginning of that meaty part where you've got to spend months and months and months thinking about theoretical frameworks and methodologies. I thought I'd give a really brief overview of this, and I'm always more than happy to talk about it more with anyone who wants to. These next 2 figures that I'm going to show you are actually part of my thesis, but I made them before my confirmation, I want to say, and they stuck. So I actually didn't look at them for almost a year or even 2, I think, and I went back and I went, oh my God, here we go, now I have to put them in a thesis. How are these going to fit? And I went, this is what I did. I thought about it, I planned it, I had it in my head, and that's actually how it worked out. So my ontological and epistemological approaches align with pragmatism. And part of this whole learning journey, and one of the joys I've had working with all the women that I've shared that experience with as part of our writing group, is a better understanding of my perception of the world and how I want to measure what happens in the world. So me experiencing that journey with all of the people I was fortunate enough to, from different faculties with different experiences, all these different research approaches, I understood that this is actually how I see the world. The world is the way it is, and I need to measure it however I need to measure it. I need to use whatever methods I need to use to answer the questions that I have. That's kind of how I approach everything. That's how I kind of think about the world. So reflecting on that over 5.5 years of PhD, this experience gives you insight not just to your research but to yourself as well. My theoretical perspective was this idea of this tri-dimensional, this student engagement that has 3 parts: behavioural, emotional and cognitive. I use mixed methods, so quantitative and qualitative approaches, explanatory, sequential design. These are all the things they make us think about in great depth in Faculty of Education. Means I collected or focus on collecting my quantitative data before my qualitative data. So I use the qualitative data to explain what I found in the quantitative results. And finally, these are the methods I use. So I developed my own questionnaire. Never do that. I can talk to you about why. I use cognitive interviews, which is where participants actually do your questionnaire so you can see how it functions and if it works. Semi-structured interviews where I got to sit down with teachers, and observations in classrooms. As far as actually collecting the data, I was going to do a pilot study which turned into a pilot phase because I pre-tested before my pilot phase. I did my pilot study, which found things that weren't quite right with the questionnaire. Again, never develop your own questionnaire. And then use the cognitive interviews to kind of try and iron out the ambiguities that I found in the questionnaire before I went to phase 1, where the questionnaire was distributed nationally. I had a fun 6 months in my PhD getting ethics approval, not just from the university, but from every educational state authority in Australia. That was probably more like 10 months, I think I was being, being part-time, I suppose, gave me that luxury. So considering I'd spent all the time doing that, it was a bit disappointing when I had 223 usable results from that questionnaire. But these things happen, it's all a learning journey, and I would do it slightly differently next time. The next phase was observations and interviews in the classroom. Obviously the best bit, I got to sit in teachers' classrooms and got to talk about their teaching afterwards. And then I mixed together all the information I had when I got to the end. So when this gets put together right at the beginning of your PhD and you think, oh my God, what does that even mean? I'm kind of off the end of that now. I'm in that little blue area at the end doing the next thing. So it does happen. You do get there. These are my research questions. I wanted to find out what teachers understand student engagement to be. I wanted to find out what strategies they think are useful for supporting it, if they prioritise any of the dimensions. So do they think that emotional engagement is more important than behavioural engagement, or any which way? And how does what they understand actually align with their practice? So I collected data for those questions through all of the phases, but that final one, I needed that phase 2 where I did the observations and interviews to really see if what they said matched what they did. When it came to writing it up, I decided I wasn't going to write about that one. Once again, if anyone wants to talk about the process involved in that, happy to, but I was very, very happy with the decision. So what did I find? And I do have a few notes. I apologise. I don't normally have notes, but I haven't been well. So I've got a few things in front of me just to remind me what I wanted to talk about. So I found out that some teachers find it challenging to define student engagement. So they gave me circular definitions. They talked about engagement in terms of engagement. So things like students are actively engaged in their learning. I said, tell me for you, what does engagement mean? Students are engaged. Whether students are meaningfully engaged in their activities. Student engagement means engaging the students. Students engaging with the learning material, but also engaging with each other. So not only did that not give me insight into what teachers' understandings were, but it also maybe suggests a lack of understanding of the concept itself for these particular teachers. I also found that teachers define student engagement in different ways, and I found this through the quantitative and qualitative data. Some teachers define it in terms of behavioural or emotional or cognitive. Some defined it using more than one dimension, and some defined it considering all of them. Very, very few teachers when asked to talk about student engagement, talk about behavioural, emotional and cognitive aspects of it. They do tend to really focus on behavioural or a combination of two. Also, which I wasn't expecting, but I've since done obviously quite a bit of reading on it, how many teachers talk about being actively engaged. The most common, and I mean common in the qualitative data, was actively participating and active participation. But actively taking part, actively completing tasks, actively listening, actively working in groups, actively working on problems, active and independent learners, actively asking questions. The reason that this is important, and I can show you one of those word clouds at the end to show that they use the word active almost as much as they use the word engagement, is that this is going to influence how teachers teach in the classroom. Because if for them a student being engaged means a student is doing something that they can see, they'll make pedagogical choices based on that. I did have one interesting comment from a participant that said the opposite to that. It's not all about being active, because a student can be sitting there staring out the window and deeply cognitively engaged with the learning and reflecting and considering that. They don't have to physically be doing something, but that wasn't most of what what was presented by most of the teachers. So which dimensions do teachers think are more important? So I found that they do prioritise the dimensions differently. Some thought behavioural was the most important. So an example quote, if you don't have students in the right behavioural frame of mind and focus on all the things you need at a classroom level, then it's hard to engage them at a cognitive level. Good point. Some thought emotional engagement came first. An example quote, the relationships you have with students are key, and they're the building blocks for the next stages that follow it. Some thought cognitive engagement was the most important. If you're displaying enthusiasm for the subject and you're making it interesting, then you can model the behaviour. And one even explained the way that they described it as a cascade. If I do this, then this happens, and then this happens. So teachers, all the teachers I interviewed had a very clear idea of which one they thought was the most important. I also found that they placed higher importance on, this is through the quantitative data, higher importance on strategies that support students' behavioural engagement, and less, oh sorry, not the quantitative, this was the teachers I observed and interviewed, and less importance on strategies that supported students' cognitive engagement. So there's a lot more focus on supporting students' behaviour in the classroom than there was in supporting their curiosity, their deeper thinking, their higher order thinking. In the quantitative data, we found a negative correlation between the ICSIA value of the school. So for anyone that's not familiar with that, that's the index of community socioeconomic, I did write it down because I knew I was going to forget when I was up here. Yeah, index of community and socioeconomic advantage. It's not exactly sort of the SES, but every single school in Australia has one of these values. So it is something that can be measured. And what we found is that the lower the value of that assigned to the school, the higher the teachers placed on the strategies that support the behavioural and cognitive strategies. But as that shifted, so those higher ICSIA schools, the independent schools, for example, those were a lot less important. So final research question, how does it all match up? And this is what I really wanted to find out. For me, this was the most important part, because I wanted to not just know what the teachers understand student engagement to be, I want to see what is in the classroom. It brings it all back to when I was a high school teacher. So I found quite, thank you. I found quite obviously, as you've already seen in response to other research questions, that teachers understand student engagement differently. And they implement different strategies to support it. But the teachers that I observed and interviewed fell into three main categories. There were the ones that did, that what they said aligned with what they did in the classroom. If they thought cognitive engagement was the most important, they were the teaching strategies they prioritised in the classroom. The second category what they'd said didn't match, but when we talked about it, they explained why they'd done it differently. So they changed their teaching practice, even though, for example, one participant, emotional engagement was definitely the most important. All the strategies that support that, those relationships were key. But on the day I watched them, they were getting ready for a test. So what we were doing in class that day was this, so therefore I taught this way. And then a third category where they talked a particular way about student engagement and didn't enact that at all. So overall, what did I find? In a nutshell, PhD in a nutshell. Teachers understand student engagement in different ways and they teach to support it in different ways. But what they do does not always, what they say doesn't always align with what they do in practice. In my thesis, I did explore some reasons for this. There is some research out there to suggest why, but not a definitive answer. But basically, there's a whole lot of contextual things that could be impacting it. So a lack of understanding of what student engagement is, which we can already see, but it's really diverse. The actual demographic of the school, teacher self-efficacy, which is their confidence to actually implement the strategies that they've heard of, the crowded curriculum, which as teachers we're all very aware of. But also there were some teachers I spoke to where their values didn't actually align with what the school was expecting of them. So they said emotional engagement was the most important and the school was pushing a very cognitive, high achievement agenda. And for some of those teachers, their class, I don't want to say their classrooms were a bit of a mess, but for them, it might be an explanation of that misalignment. So what's next? We always talk about impact. I think I'm going to go a little into my question time, but impact is really important. And sometimes you don't think about it till you're finished, but you're supposed to be thinking about it the whole time. So this model that's up here, the top half's I've already published in a paper in 2020, and it's based on research in this field. Teaching strategies, I know you can't see it, it's too small, but teaching strategies that support behavioural, emotional and cognitive engagement. The bottom half comes from my research, and these are the words of the teachers that they use to describe behavioural, emotional and cognitive engagement. So putting it in, this is literally an A4 printout. What do I want them to do with this? I want them to print it out and stick it on the wall next to their desk. I want teachers to use this in the classroom because on this they can see what they can do and what an engaged student, a behavioural engaged student would look like, what an emotionally engaged student could look like. It's not, yeah. This is currently under review. This is in a paper that I have submitted that's currently under review, and it's already being used in a primary school in Townsville as part of their professional development with their teachers this year. So I'm looking forward to the next meeting with that leadership team because they're so excited. I was like, this is how I did it in my thesis. They're like, we're going to do it like that, except we might do this. I'm like, that sounds amazing. So I'm really looking forward to talking to them again. And the big picture is that I'd actually love to develop an app. I want to take the thesis I developed, the questionnaire I developed, take all these other instruments that already exist, so I'm not making another questionnaire, that measure all of these contextual things like well-being and everything like that, and put it into something practical. Teachers are time poor. I want them to be able to sit down in the staff room and interact with something that's actually interesting. Do this quiz. What does that mean? It means this. Here's a little summary of what I can do differently in my classroom that can actually literally make a difference. And impact what students experience. These are my publications so far from this thesis. I agree with Megan Lee about getting yourself out there. One of those is a conversation article a few years ago, but I'm also an teaching academic at this university, so I've got to go for the high quartile ones as well. And I'm sorry I've gone over, but I have to put this in here. I only added it this morning. I couldn't have done this journey without these women, and I had to leave that to you. Thank you. Everyone, I think I've used up all my question time. I think I'm going to have to hand over.
well, thank you, and congratulations on your original contribution to knowledge, Dr. Kelly.
Thanks, Craig.
And also for the clearly what's a rich vein of further work ahead in a really important area. So well done. Thank you for an excellent presentation as well. Do we have any questions from the audience for Dr. Kelly? Carl.
You mentioned at the start some of the differences between, I think a lot of your participants use the word active, but I'm going to use visible. So visible engagement as opposed to invisible engagement, and use the example of a student looking out the window but very cognitively engaged in the material. Did your research come across any strategies to recognise when students are invisibly engaged in learning?
It's not something I've done, but there is other research around that. A lot of different things like eye tracking, clickers. There's been research where students have like little buzzers or apps on their phones that literally buzz every 5 minutes, and they just click a button to say, I'm interested, I'm not interested, whatever it is. When they work on the computer, tracking their eyes to see what they're actually looking at on the screen. Questionnaires, everything like that. I mean, and this is part of the problem and probably why teachers perceive it differently, because we can only see what we can see. We don't know what's happening in their head. But I think we need to step away from the idea that students have to be active, because there's more to being engaged in something. I go for a walk and I have my best ideas when I'm going for a walk. I'm not actively writing a research paper. I'm not reading articles or anything like that. I'm totally... We don't know what's going on inside their heads is the big answer, I suppose. There is a lot of research around it. It's not what mine focused on though. But yeah, I think if we can switch teachers' perceptions away from this idea that that's the only way that engagement can be demonstrated, I think that will be important.
Awesome, thank you.
And we can take one more, I think. So we can take one more, I think. So Jubilee, you can do the honours. Oh, we can do it. We'll fit both of you in, as long as we're quick.
Thanks, guys. Megan, I just love your research. I love your work, and it's fantastic working with you. But one of the things I'm excited about is you getting out there for teachers that one page A4, and I think that's wonderful. And I'm sure that you'll have lots of people wanting that, but wanting also a presentation of ways to do it. Definitely something we need in classrooms and schools. Definitely. But I was wondering about children, students. Have you got plans to ask them what it looks like, feels like,
so there's
sounds
a
like?
lot of research around what students think is engaging that already exists. It was originally going to be part of this, but you know, right at the beginning where they're like, it's too big, it's too big, it's too big, and you go cull. Part of that next step would be to consider this particular model or framework that I'm talking about and how that sits with students as well. Yeah, no, I think that's really important.
That was awesome. I used to be a high school teacher, and I wish I had known what you just talked about, because I remember feeling
I wish I had known what I was talking about when I was a high school teacher.
I might still be a teacher. I remember being so frustrated and just saying, come on, you know, what are you doing? And I'm like, miss, I'm paying attention. I'm like, oh, it's not, you know. And yeah, even just something in the training, my teacher training, or a poster, I don't know, something, a professional development would have made a huge, huge difference. So yeah, well done. That's awesome.
Yeah, thank you.
Next to everyone's Bloom's taxonomy poster.
Yeah. Rip the balloons one down, just put things up.
Oh, yeah. Thanks again.
Thank you,
Morgan. That was great.
everyone.